Okay, so a couple pieces of housekeeping. Some of you I know just registered. If you didn't see the announcement, go on eClass and look at the first lecture. It's been uploaded to YouTube. That's linked to on eClass. Just a reminder, I've overheard some of you outside of class making partnerships, so not urgent, but try at some point to get a partner for the peer review. Something I added to eClass is a link to the Google Doc that has all of the videos I'll be showing. I think I'm only showing one today, but as the course goes on, if there's a topic that you want to choose for your paper, you may want to watch some of those videos in their entirety, because sometimes I'll just show a clip that may be useful for you to generate new ideas. Additionally, if you didn't see the announcement, congratulations. You all get 1 out of 1 on attendance quiz 1. Some of you joined late, so don't worry about that if you weren't here. So there'll be 4 more at random points in the semester. And one small change I made, I may have seemed unsure on the first day about this, but for the peer review, you will not have to print it and bring it to class. I decided that if I want to have you guys discuss it, you can just bring it up on your computer. So the only assignment you have to print and bring to class is the final paper. For the paper draft and the peer review, just upload it to eClass and send it to your partner. And then for the final paper, you both upload it to eClass and bring it to class. Okay, any housekeeping questions before we get started on the book? Okay, so typically, chapters will be supplemented with extra readings. Chapter 1 is an exception. It's just a broad introduction, so there will not be any journal articles associated with it. So last class, I talked about the difference between moral philosophy and moral psychology. I'm going to add a little bit to that distinction. So I said yesterday, or on Wednesday, that moral psychologists ask empirical questions about the world, right? So they're using observation and evidence to come at conclusions, specifically about how people think about moral problems. So they're not interested in what the correct answer is. They want to know how people think about morality. I said that moral philosophers ask, at least one kind of question they ask is conceptual questions about morality. So I'm going to be a bit more narrow than I was last class. Conceptual questions have to do with what terms mean. So what do our moral concepts mean? Things like right and wrong, good and evil. A term that the book adds, which you could classify as falling under conceptual, but it'll be useful to distinguish them. Another kind of question that moral philosophers ask is normative questions. So this has to do with what the right answer is. So what should we do? Normative comes from the word norm, so having to do with shoulds. Which is, again, exactly the kind of question that moral psychologists don't concern themselves with. And I'm going to add up another distinction. Hopefully this won't irritate you too much, but within conceptual, we can think of 2 different ways of answering those questions. One is by looking at what concepts mean in ordinary language. So, moral concepts are part of our everyday life. Since you were very young, all of you have engaged in language like, you shouldn't do that, that's not fair, that's a bad person, etc. And there are conventions for how to use these terms. You can look up the meaning of these terms in the dictionary. Any child can give you a rough sense of what these terms mean. So one thing you can ask is, what do these terms mean in ordinary language? A different thing you can do is put forward technical terms. So there's a distinction between ordinary language terms and technical terms. So there's a long history of philosophers putting forward technical terms, meaning they just make it up, give it a precise meaning, because they think the term will be useful. So to make an analogy with the sciences, take the term temperature. Temperature is an ordinary language term. Versions of it were around before physics and thermodynamics. But what physicists did is they put forward a technical notion of temperature, where it means basically how fast the molecules are vibrating. So it's somewhat related to the ordinary language term, but it's more precise and therefore more useful for theorizing. And it's important to keep in mind which question you're asking when you're asking what a term means. If you're asking about this, you're asking what it does mean, at least in ordinary language. When you're putting forward a technical term, you're asking, what is a good thing to mean by the term? In other words, you're engaging in what some philosophers call conceptual engineering. You're trying to modify or adjust or put forward a definition of a term that's useful. So we'll see various attempts at putting forward technical definitions of terms that's more useful. Any questions about the basic layout here? Yes?
Can I ask you to go over conceptual engineering one more time?
Yeah, for sure. So conceptual engineering is when you're putting forward technical terms, you're trying to put forward a concept that's useful. So you're taking a term, modifying it, adjusting it, and trying to make it useful in a particular way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Could that be applied to slang?
I guess so. You can think of slang as like, I don't know, teenage conceptual engineering or something, like, making up terms, maybe not for theoretical purposes, but just for fun. So, yeah, conceptual engineering is grown-up fancy slang, maybe, if that helps you think about it. Okay. Next term, and it relates to some degree to the idea of conceptual engineering. And this is very important in psychology, is construct validity. Most of you should have come across this term by now. Construct validity has to do with psychological measurements. And construct validity is about, does the test measure the right theoretical construct? So you have a construct, which is a theoretical idea, something that you have theorized exists, and you want a test that measures it. Test or measure. So this relationship is measurement. And a test has construct validity if it measures the right construct. So an example you're all familiar with is IQ tests. So psychologists give a definition of intelligence that is somewhat different from the ordinary language sense of the term. Psychologists disagree about exactly how to define the construct, but it means something like cognitive ability, how good you are at solving cognitively difficult problems. So that's theoretically the idea of what intelligence is, of what the construct is. And the question is, does this particular IQ test measure that? Or is it measuring something else? This is an imperfect analogy, but you could think again of the temperature case. Physicists define temperature in terms of a theory. Temperature in physics means roughly how fast the molecules are moving, as I said. And then you could ask, is this thermometer measuring that? Is it measuring how fast the molecules are moving? This is a controversial notion in psychology. I had a professor who thought this is too theoretical, too philosophical. We shouldn't be asking questions like, does this test measure a theoretical construct? But it's very important in contemporary psychological theory, so it's good to know what it means. The book has a brief discussion of it. Any questions about construct validity? Okay. Then the introduction talks about specific theories of ethics. This is, how many of you, by the way, have taken a philosophy or ethics course? Okay, maybe a third. So this will be a review for the third of you. Actually, for those who raised your hand, can anyone tell me, what are the three, and if you look at the key terms you'll know too, but what are the three, and you can say any of them, probably most popular ethical theories in philosophy? So some utilitarianism. What's the main rival to utilitarianism? Starts with a D. So utilitarianism is one. The other, I'll just go in order. So, and actually for utilitarianism falls under the heading of consequentialism. So consequentialism is a broad set of ethical theories according to which it's the consequences that determine whether an action is right or wrong. Consequences, or you could say effects. So if an action leads to good consequences, even if you intuitively don't like it, it's a good action. If it leads to bad consequences or bad effects, then it's a bad action. The question then is, what sorts of consequences are good or bad? And the answer that utilitarians give, and utilitarianism is by far the most discussed version of consequentialism, the answer that they give is what matters is conscious states. In particular, pleasant or unpleasant ones. So what matters is, does the action make people more happy or less happy? Not just the person doing the action, but everyone considered equally. So the goal, this is often summarized in a pithy way, you should be trying to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Another pithy way of saying it is, you want to maximize happiness impartially. So in the case of the dilemmas we saw last time, a utilitarian is going to say in both cases, you should kill the one to save the five, even if it involves pushing, because then you're obviously increasing overall happiness. Fewer families are sad because someone died. So that's one family of ethical theories. Another family of theories goes under the name deontology. I think the root word in Greek has to do with duties, something like that. On this view, there are some types of actions that are intrinsically wrong because they violate duties that we have. And crucially, they are wrong regardless of the consequences. And same with things being good. Some things are good regardless of the consequences. So the most famous proponent of this view by far is Immanuel Kant. And Kant thought that you could figure out what's right or wrong without doing any empirical investigation. You don't have to look at the world, you can just sit down and think about it. And he thought that what you should do is take different principles that you could possibly have, like lie all the time, don't lie at all, whatever. And his standard was, if you cannot consistently will that that principle be followed, it's a bad principle. So in the case of lying, no one could rationally wish that everyone lie all the time, so therefore it's a bad principle. Whereas you could conceivably wish that everyone tell the truth all the time, so that's the one you should go for. Obviously I'm simplifying, but he thought you could arrive at principles in that way. And if it turns out that lying is wrong, for him that means it's always wrong, even if you're lying to save someone's life. Another principle that we'll spend a lot of time on that comes out of Kant is it's always wrong to use people as a mere means. So if you're using someone to achieve some end and not respecting their humanity, that's always wrong. This is why in the footbridge case, pushing someone is wrong because you're using them as a trolley stopper. So people in kind of the Kantian tradition have generally said that it's wrong to push someone in front of a trolley. And the final one, which is a different sort of theory, but it's the one that usually gets discussed alongside these three, the other two, is virtue ethics. This one is most famously associated with Aristotle. Utilitarianism has a few famous defenders. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, but we don't have to worry about that right now. So virtue ethics kind of shies away from principles. It says that what matters is developing certain character traits through habit and practice. And once you have the right sorts of virtues, the right sorts of moral traits, you'll know what the right thing to do is in any given situation. What are those virtues? How do we know what the virtues are? What Aristotle says, and we'll spend more time on this in chapter 9, is they are what occupies what he calls the golden mean. He thinks that virtues in almost every case are in between, like mean in the sense of average, two vices. So easy to understand example is courage. So courage is a virtue for Aristotle. A vice of excess related to courage would be, you charge into battle by yourself with one weapon against an army. For Aristotle, that's not courage, that's foolishness. And the other extreme would obviously be cowardice, right? If you aren't willing to go in at all, that's cowardice. So courage is knowing when to go into battle and when to not. So it's having that golden mean. So how do we decide between different ethical theories? And by the way, everything I'm saying right now would fall under the heading of normative questions in that kind of flow chart I had earlier. So the most important concept, I think, in this whole book, the author returns to it again and again, is reflective equilibrium. He's saying it's the most important concept in the book. Hint, hint. So I'm actually going to build up to that by contrasting it with a different term, and that is foundationalism. Foundationalism. These are two different approaches to justification in ethics. ethics. So by justification, I mean, how do we know whether a given theory is right or wrong? What justifies our belief, say, that utilitarianism is right or whichever. And foundationalism applies to other areas too. So foundationalism is the view that if you want to know what's true, you have to first find a secure foundation. So something you can know for sure. And then you can build up the rest of knowledge on that secure foundation. You don't need to know this name, but if you look at some of my lectures in Site 405, the most famous proponent of this is René Descartes. So this is just an illustration. Descartes famously tried to doubt everything. So he wanted to know, like, what can I know for sure? He says, I can't know that I'm in a room right now because I could just be hallucinating. I can't know that I have a body. I could just be being deceived about that. And so he doubted everything and eventually arrived at the one thing he thought he could know for sure. Any philosophy people, do you know what it is? What's the one thing he knows for sure?
I'm a thinking thing, right? Is it, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. I'm a thinking thing. The famous line is, I think, therefore I am. So he can't know that he has a body or that he's really in a room right now, but he at least knows that he's doubting. And he says, I can't doubt that I know I'm thinking right now, and if I'm thinking, I must exist. I might be wrong about various other things, but I at least know that for sure. So for Descartes, that was his foundation. And then he had an argument for being able to infer from that God existed, and then that God wouldn't deceive him, so that's how he builds up the rest of knowledge. So you don't need to know his particular version, but that's an example of a foundationalist system in which you want something you can know for sure, and then you can build on it. Reflective equilibrium takes a very different approach. It doesn't demand that we have something certain. It just says we'll start with what we have, whether or not we know it's true for sure. So in the case of ethics, actually I'm just going to erase. So the stuff I'm going to put in the middle has to do with reflective equilibrium. So we have various intuitive judgments. So things that we just intuitively think are wrong. This isn't part of reflective equilibrium, but we're going to see there's an evolutionary and cultural story to be told about why we have the particular judgments that we have. But leaving that aside, wherever they come from, we have these intuitive judgments. So you can think of them as little data points. So these would include judgments like, murder is wrong, rape is wrong, physical assault is wrong, whatever, helping someone is morally good. So that's what we start with. And none of these, we're not claiming to know these for sure, that we can potentially revise them, but we'll start with what we have. And what we do is we posit principles. And the principles are posited to explain our judgments. So it's useful to have a smaller set of principles that we can use for adjudicating disagreement than just having all these random, disconnected judgments. So for example, one principle might be, suffering is wrong, or causing suffering is wrong. So that would explain why killing people is wrong, you make them suffer, you make their families suffer, why rape is wrong, and so on. So we just put that forward and say, okay, this principle can explain a lot of the judgments that we already make. But then, one of our principles may disagree with this, or one of our judgments may contradict the principle we put forward. So for example, most people in this room, in fact I'm sure all of you, think that performing surgery on someone is morally permissible. It's not wrong to do surgery on people. Okay, so we have an intuitive judgment that contradicts the principle. So then we modify the principle. Maybe we say, okay, suffering is wrong unless it causes more happiness long term. So it's a kind of utilitarian modification to the principle. Okay, so now the principle and the judgments are in agreement or equilibrium. So that's how a correction can go this way. But if a principle has gone through this kind of back and forth where it's been modified to fit a large number of judgments, we may actually go the other way. We may use this principle to override a judgment that we hold, especially if it's one that we are less sure of. So for example, most people intuitively feel that torturing people is wrong. But we have this principle, causing suffering is wrong unless it leads to more happiness long term, right? That was how we made it consistent with the judgment we have about surgery. So we may say, you know what, we intuitively feel like torture is wrong, but since we have this really good principle that explains a lot of our judgments, we're gonna say that torture is okay if it leads to more happiness long term. You know, if there's like a bomb that's gonna kill 100 people and someone knows where it is, it's okay to torture someone to find the bomb. Now, I'm not necessarily defending that view, I'm just saying that would be an example of how a principle that's well supported by intuitive judgments, we may actually go the other way and say, we're actually going to abandon this intuition because this principle has so much going for it. So that's reflective equilibrium, or I should say, reflective equilibrium, just to give a definition, is a state where your principles and your judgments are in agreement with each other. That you can, upon reflection, endorse the principles and judgments that you have. So as I say, very important concept. Any questions about that? Okay, to reinforce that, I'm going to show a video of someone else explaining it, just so you hear it from someone else. So hopefully that helps to reinforce. Yes?
Does it matter if you start with the principle or with the judgment?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear, the question was, does it matter if you start with the principle or the judgment? And I think the standard account would be, we do start with the judgments, because those are things we're almost born with. We have these intuitions about what's wrong before we can really posit abstract principles. So I think that's the right way to think about it. There's a kind of analogy between this process of reflective equilibrium and science. Don't put too much weight on this analogy, but we have data, right, these data points, and we posit theories to explain those data. And in a similar way, it's at first what we're doing is trying to make the theory fit with the data. But if a theory enjoys a large body of support, it explains a wide range of data, we may actually use a theory to cast doubt on data. So one example, and that may sound anathema to you, but one example is Einstein's theory. Einstein's theory has been remarkably successful, so successful that if there's a result that appears to contradict it, it's assumed that something went wrong. So some of you may know in the mid-2000s, I think it was, there was a result in a lab in Europe, like one of the particle accelerators, that found something going faster than the speed of light. And physicists did not say, oh, Einstein's theory must be wrong. They assumed someone must have made a mistake. They must have done the experiment wrong, or the machine must have malfunctioned. They looked more closely, that's exactly what happened. There's some analogy there. Now, one debate that we're going to be talking about later that relates to a possible difference here is, are the principles that we arrive at true in any objective sense? If we go through this process of reflective equilibrium, do we have any reason to believe that the principles are objectively true? Objectively true meaning true whether or not anyone believes them. presumably we want to say that in the case of science. We want to say that, the fact that the Earth orbits the sun is not dependent on the fact that we believe it. It was true when everyone thought otherwise. It's much more controversial whether we want to say the same thing about ethics. One thing I'll just say in passing, one reason why it's more doubtful in the case of ethics is there are really good arguments for the view that's called scientific realism, which is the view that scientific theories, at least mature ones, are true, whether or not anyone accepts them. And I talk more about that in Psych 405, won't get into that now, but and those arguments just don't apply, at least many of them, in the case of ethics. Okay, any last questions before I move on? Actually, I'm just curious for a show of hands, because this is one of the biggest debates in ethics. We'll be talking about it later. Not having seen the debates yet, so two views, moral realism, moral anti-realism. Moral realism is the view that moral statements are capable of being true whether or not anyone believes them. So slavery is wrong, lying is wrong. Those are just true, and if everyone decided they weren't true, everyone would just be wrong. Moral anti-realism is a view that morality is an expression of our preferences and values, but they're not in any sense objectively true. Show of hands, who's inclined towards something like moral realism? Who's inclined towards something like moral anti-realism? So close to 50, maybe 60-40. Okay, interesting. So we're going to spend some time on that later in the course. So what can moral psychology contribute to this? As I mentioned in passing, one thing it can do is explain where these intuitions come from. So in philosophy, usually these intuitions are just taken for granted. We just have them, they're what we have to work with, we start from that. What a psychologist can do is explain what causes these intuitions, what causes them in our brain, what in our evolutionary heritage led to us having these particular intuitions. And maybe in some cases we can uncover processes that cause these intuitions that we don't like or don't endorse. So for example, the intuitions may be caused by some kind of bias, and that may cause us to maybe not trust that intuition. And therefore we can draw on findings from cognitive psychology. So the book has a discussion of this. This is probably review, at least if you've taken cognitive psychology. So maybe I should block after this. Okay, so we'll do a little poll on this. So 2 ways of framing. How many of you have seen this before? Maybe a third. Okay, so 2 vaccines. 600 people are going to die of a particular disease. If you give vaccine A, you will save 200 people for sure. Vaccine B, you have a 33% chance of saving everyone, a 2/3 chance of saving no one. So those are the 2 choices. So think about it for a bit. Who is inclined to go with vaccine A? Who's inclined to go with vaccine B? So the majority go for A. Now, this may not work because you're getting both, but so that aligns with what usually happens. Most people choose A over B. So it's framed in terms of saving, not in terms of loss. When it's vaccine C versus D, you frame it in terms of how many will die. So 400 will die versus 33% chance that no one will die, 67% chance that everyone will die. And then people are much more likely to choose D, even though B and D are the same. It's just framed differently. And also, each one has an expected number of lives saved of 200 if you think about it in economics terms. So this is an example of what psychologists call loss aversion. Yes, sir.
How is anyone picking B or D?
Well, you were given B first, so maybe it's framing how you're looking at D.
No, but like the wording that's there right now it's saying that for B and D, the majority, like it's the most likely outcome is that the entire human race goes extinct.
Oh, I don't know if it's everyone on Earth.
But it says of saving nobody, right?
I think it means of the 600 who are going to die. If I haven't read this paper all, but I think it's 600 people will die, and you have a choice of doing these two things. I don't think it's like 600 left on Earth, unless I'm misremembering the paper. I guess, yeah, nobody means of the 600. So at least that's the way to think about it without running into that problem. In any case, so this is an example of, well, certainly whether or not that's right, the fact that it's worded in terms of gain versus loss shouldn't matter. What matters is how many people die or are saved. But in fact, there's a very large effect of simply how the question is worded. So this is an example of a bias against a choice that's framed in terms of loss. And there are all sorts of biases like that, where upon reflection, you would not endorse that. If you thought about it carefully, you wouldn't think to yourself, yes, it really matters what word the person used before we let X number of people die. So, as I say, the book has a discussion of that. So we can bring that kind of thing to bear in the case of ethics. We'll see a long discussion of that in chapter 8. The book then has what is apparently a new section, so prior versions of the textbook did not have this section, but it's on two big problems that have been uncovered in psychology, or at least have been noticed. And those are the weird problem and the replication crisis. So I assume most, if not all of you, have heard of both of these. Someone tell me, what's the weird problem in psychology? Yep.
So like the fact that most of the research that's done is done in gets Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic
Exactly.
areas of the world.
Exactly, yeah, right. So most psychology studies are done in so-called weird countries, as he correctly said, Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. And actually it's in a way worse than that, because it's usually done in university psychology undergraduates from those countries, so an even narrower sample of the human species. Even though we want to draw conclusions about human thinking in general, we are unjustified in doing so if we have weird samples. So there's a growing move towards doing cross-cultural replication. And it seems quite obvious that this would be relevant in the case of ethics. So as a discussion topic today, what are some examples of ways that culture could affect moral judgment? So we're not debating the merits of different cultural approaches, but either from psychology facts that you know, or from experience traveling, or from cultural background that you have, what are some possible ways that different cultural backgrounds could affect moral judgment, and therefore ways in which moral psychology could be affected by this weird problem? So again, groups of like 2 to 4, 2 to 5, and we'll discuss 4 a bit. Not all at once. Okay, some of the conversations are dying down. What are some things that the groups came up with? And by the way, in case you didn't get through the video, the part where you guys are all talking obviously is cut out of the video. It's only if you volunteer and answer during discussion time that it'll be on YouTube. So what are some thoughts that different groups had? And you don't have to share. No, have any thoughts. Yeah.
I kind of thought of the idea that I wonder if it makes a difference if your dominant culture sort of believes or is dominated by a religion that is like performance based, and really values what you physically do versus a religion that is more, I guess, forgiveness based.
Okay, interesting. Yep. So that's one. So different emphases, different religions make. Yeah, that's a good example. Yep.
Cultures that value one sex over another.
Yep.
Might
Yes.
think too, yeah.
Yep. So that's another way in which it could be relevant. Other thoughts. Yep.
Like the amount of like education you're actually able to access, depending language, culture, like you may not know some things that other cultures may know more about.
Yeah. Okay, I saw one other hand. We'll do one more. Yep.
Like democracies versus like communism. One may be more collective based and one is more individualized.
Yep, that's another. These are all great examples. I was going to show a video as well to illustrate, but this time flew by. Any questions on anything I've said? I think we'll probably call it. There's no point in watching the video past the end point. Okay, we'll stop there. I will see you all next week.